So, Charlie, I'm really pleased to have you today because I'm actually going to get a lot from this myself.
Mm.
This is such an important topic at the moment, so I'm so grateful that you can find some time for us.
Mm.
So listen, I've got so many questions, but let me start with the first one, which I mentioned in the introduction, because you talk about teaching people to play the inner game, and I think that's a wonderful phrase. I personally haven't heard it used,
Yeah.
in that way. Tell me a bit more. What does it mean? Tell me a bit about inner
Mm.
game.
Well, Maria, I'd like to say it's my phrase. It actually comes from a sports psychologist, Tim Galloway, who wrote a book called The Inner Game. But I love it. I think it's a great metaphor, and it talks about if we can play the inner game of what's inside of us, so what we're thinking and feeling, and even actually play our biology better, so what we do with ourselves physically, we're going to respond better to the outer game. And I refer the outer game of life. We're all playing an outer game, aren't we? Whether we're talking about with work right now, with, what we're leading and working in with the uncertainty right now, our family. So the outer game is that. And if we play the inner game better, I believe that we're going to play the outer game better.
I like that. I like that. So tell me, why did you get interested in this, and particularly resilience? Because that's what you're known for.
Yeah, well, I think first and foremost, I'm not a naturally resilient person. I'll be really honest with you. I'm actually more on the mentally sensitive side. And I've had to develop this capacity just for my own self. And it comes from like a few areas. So I was a talented sportsman. I played rugby for England as a schoolboy, West of England hockey, county cricket, incredibly talented. But I struggled to perform under pressure. The little voice often got the better of me. So my mindset wasn't great when I really needed it. So that's where I think it first started. Secondly, I was involved in a very traumatic car accident when I was 21. And to cut a long story short, it was my fault. I fell asleep at the wheel. It was my responsibility, and my sister was in the passenger seat. Now, she ended up in a very unwell. She was in a coma and actually was moments away from passing. And thankfully, she didn't, thankfully. But that accident has taught me a huge amount about resilience and recovery and how to overcome adversity. And it took some time, but I've sort of taken the lessons from that. And that's another area. And then lastly, Maria, I went into the health and fitness industry, and I was a personal trainer for a long time. And I saw time and time again, when people are physically stronger and fitter, that their capacity to cope with challenge grew. And I'm a big believer in that. And I genuinely believe that resilience is one of the most important human capacities that we have, that we can all get better at. And right now it's particularly important. So thank you.
Do you know, I didn't realise we had so much in common, because I don't consider myself particularly resilient. I mean, I've had to, and particularly good and strong in that respect. I'm quite emotional. I'm Italian. I'm emotional, Can't help. I'm a girl. I'm emotional. I'm menopausal. I've got it all against me. Hormonal, Italian, female. Hey, so I get it. So it's good to hear that it's something that you can work on. So give me your definition of resilience.
Okay, it's a great question. So I describe it as our ability to prepare, adapt, recover, and also grow stronger from stress, challenge, and adversity. Okay, so I think each of those points are particularly important. And I add the other one, grow stronger, because from my own experience of going through such a traumatic accident, I did grow stronger from that. I would never want that to happen, but it has made me a stronger human being and enabled me to deal better with the challenges that I face in life now.
That's really good. I like the way you broke it down. It's sort of like a step by step. Yeah. Is that how you break it down? Because you can teach people to be more resilient. Yes.
Absolutely. Look, some of it is genetic, Maria. I mean, some of us, we are predisposed to conditions in our formative years that will either support our resilience or not. We can't deny that. But it also, from my own experience of being mentally sensitive, we can actually get better at it. And we're all resilient to some degree. And I think it's really important to remember that, because we've all have been through adversity to some extent in our lives. That's shown resilience. So yes, I break it down into steps. And I think it's really important we can teach it.
So what the first step you said, prepare. So here's a question for you. Nobody saw what we're dealing with coming, unless you go back to people who've said that there was always going to be some kind of virus, some kind of pandemic, and we didn't listen. In fact, that certainly you can actually track people who've warned us.
Yeah.
But I certainly didn't see it coming in 2020. I predicted this year was going to be the best year yet. So I was wrong in that respect, although potentially it could be, because as you say, we grow stronger. So how do you prepare?
Yeah, I think that, again, a great question. Look, I didn't see a pandemic coming either, at all. But I have been talking about the importance of leading in a VUCA world for a long time. And I think now we're getting an example of this is more VUCA than we've ever been VUCA. And what does VUCA stand for? Is volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous. And I think that's being really demonstrated right now. Preparing for that. So, if I go back to my sporting analogy, an athlete will prepare for the challenge. They will put the training in, they'll put the hard work in to be able to meet the challenge. And I think we need to do the same within life. I take a lot of my, some of my research in philosophy, and the Stoics were a great example of what they called adversity training. They believed life was adversity training. So I think we can use challenge like right now as an opportunity for training. And the preparation phase is, there are many things we can do for that. And I think that's a personal thing. But I think one of the big ones for all of us is going to be our capacity to be able to inhabit uncertainty. To be able to be okay with it inside of ourselves, which is not an easy thing to do, but I believe we can get better at that, for example.
Okay, I'm going to come back to that a bit later, because I'm going to ask you for some techniques that perhaps we could use. But one of the things that we mentioned in your introduction, and I know about you, is that you particularly work with leaders on the area of resilience. So why is it so important for leaders to be resilient? I mean, it sort of seems a bit obvious, but isn't it important for everybody?
Well, absolutely, it's important for everyone. And I think it is one of the most important capacities that we all have. And personal resilience is that, they're impacting their team members, they're impacting the culture, and how they are individually is going to have an impact. We now know from science there's something called emotional contagion. So the emotional state of a leader is going to have a ripple effect onto their team and to their culture. So I think it starts with them getting themselves into a good space so that they can be in a good space for others.
Okay, I'm going to make this personal again, because I like to get therapy from my speakers. It's really it's a much cheaper way of doing it. You know what I mean? So I'm a leader. I have a team.
Yeah.
And I'm not coping particularly well because I've been hit personally. I've had a personal loss in the family. I've postponed my wedding. I'm having losses in my business. I'm not sleeping very well. I don't feel particularly resilient. And yet you're talking to me about this emotional contagion. How do I lead from a place of feeling quite on the back foot and quite weak?
Yeah. Well, it's such a big and I think important
It's a huge question. I know. Sorry,
no,
Charlie.
it's such, and I don't want to pretend that I have all the answers, because I think that's a part of, we need to start being okay with not knowing and not needing to know. And I think, that for me almost shows potentially a sign of wisdom. We don't know. And are we okay with not knowing? I think it's also a time to have the courage to be vulnerable. I really think this idea that we need to have our stuff all together at a time like this, it doesn't feel true to me, because I know I certainly don't have it all together, but I know who my support team are. I know, and I know you, Marie, and I know, for example, animals, and, it's finding your resources that work for you. And we need to respect that all of us are going on a different journey with this, that there is an emotional change curve. And I've noticed myself go through this. And that emotional change curve highlights shock, it highlights denial, it highlights hopelessness, it highlights depression before we even get to the stage of acceptance and integration. So I think the best tip I can be right now is to be kind to ourselves. It is not the time to be judging ourselves harshly and criticizing ourselves. It's to lower our expectations and maybe just keep it in the day. You know, how's today going to be? Can I make today better than yesterday? And what would be some small steps that I could do? And trust that you know as well what works for you, because what works for you might not work for me.
No, that's really great. And actually, it's what I'm trying to do, take each day at a time, in the same way that in that advice, that's really good advice. So I'm seeing a lot of people, though, scrabbling to offer new things, a lot of speakers reinventing themselves, being incredibly productive, creating lots and lots and lots of stuff. And of course, if you're in a different place on the curve, you're not ready to do that. Should we all be doing that? Should we all be changing everything now, or should we be stopping and contemplating? What's the right thing to be resilient? What would you say, or is it different for everybody?
Again, I think it is different for everyone, depending on potentially where they are on the emotional change curve. But my personal position is it's time to slow down, stop, and reflect. You know, if we can, that's my position. I'd be questioning of how much of my responses to this situation is coming from fear. Obviously, there's a huge amounts of uncertainty, but I'd be really reflecting on, why am I doing this right now, and is this the right decision? For me, I feel it is definitely an opportunity for us to slow down, to reflect, and to learn. That's my personal position.
Thank you. That gives me permission to do that. I appreciate that. So one of the things that you and I have talked about in the past is the importance, and it's one of your stages, is the recovery. And when you talk about recovery, when you're practicing sport and exercising, and I suppose also when you're dealing with difficult times, sleep is really important. And this is one of the things that actually is disrupted at this time, when you're struggling to sleep because your mind is racing with what's going on. Are there any tips you can give us to help us sleep better? Are you going to tell me to exercise more?
Okay, let's look at worry and anxiety, because so many of us are going to be feeling that. I know I've had big stages of that. And let's be kind to ourselves, because we're biologically programmed for survival as human beings. We're predisposed for anxiety and worry. 100,000 years ago, if you weren't worried walking through the savannah about something jumping out on you, you would have potentially been eaten. So it is part of us. So recognize that's it. Now, we have a genuine fear here. This is for the first time in my life, there is a genuine fear, and we should be fearful, and doing everything we can. Anxiety, unfortunately, is more self-driven, and it's going to be natural in this time. So what can we do about worry? Because I think if we can manage our worry and anxiety, we're potentially going to sleep better. So one of the things we know works, if we schedule worrying time in. So why don't you schedule some worrying time in, Maria? Put it in your diary and go, you know what? I'm going to put 45 minutes in my diary, and I'm going to worry the pants off this. I'm going to write everything down that's concerning me. Give yourself permission to allow that worry to come out, okay? And then write it down. And then do your best to let it go until the next day. I think if there's ever a time to deeply understand the serenity prayer, and now I am not traditionally religious, but I'm spiritual, and that is a great resource for me. But the serenity prayer says, we need to have the serenity to accept the things we cannot change, have the courage to change the things we can, and know the wisdom, and have the wisdom to know the difference. And if we can understand that, that could be incredibly helpful. So there we go, a couple of tips. Know that worrying is normal and be kind to yourself. Secondly, plan it in your diary, put it in there, and then maybe reflect on the serenity prayer, and do your best to focus on what's within your control and accept the things that are not. And I know that's not easy, and I'm not saying it is, but it's a practice, and we're being called to practice right now.
I think that's such great advice. I love that, because that, in a way, that is actually, I know I've got permission to worry. Therefore, if the worry strikes me when I'm supposed to be doing something else, I can say, okay, worry, hang on a minute. You've been scheduled for 5 o'clock. So chill out. We're going to sit in the garden and worry in the sunshine. That's great. That for me is great. It feels like I have control now over my worry. I like that a lot. Yeah. So tell me, what advice would you give leaders now? What additional advice? I mean, I think there's some great advice you've given already, but what else would you be saying to leaders now?
Um, I think, there's a great book that I love that's written by a guy called Ryan Halliday, which says the obstacle is the way in life. So one of the things that we can do as we're pausing and stopping is to reflect, what am I learning from this about myself? I think leadership starts with self-awareness. You know, what am I learning about my strengths and my qualities, but also the shadow side of myself? And it's an opportunity to learn so that we can become stronger and adapt and be better for the inevitable challenges that we're all going to face. I think it is the time to have the courage to, as I've mentioned before, be a bit more vulnerable and find out who those people that you feel safe with and can talk with, and be okay with uncertainty. I think role modeling that can build trust and psychological safety, and it can be a real edge for us. So again, I think that would be a tip from me. And then lastly, it's a time for, as best as we can, self-care. It's not easy, but doing our best to take care of ourselves in the way that we suit ourselves, it is a time to focus on that. I'm finding that I'm needing to double up on that at the moment. So that would be a priority. Put our own oxygen masks on first.
Yeah, no, that's a great bit of advice. So what have I missed? What haven't I asked you that's really important with regards to resilience?
I think one other thing is being crystal clear on what we stand for and what we believe in right now. Our values can be like anchors. And I often see our values, we drop them like an anchor in turbulent times. Let me give you an example. When I saw 90% of my pipeline disappearing about 15 days ago, I had my first mild panic attack, very mild, and huge amounts of anxiety kicked in. And normally my go-to methods weren't happening. So I actually kind of acted upon my values, and two of those was the courage to be authentic and vulnerable. So I reached out to a couple of friends straight away and just said, look, this is what's going on for me. I need some help and support. So that was one. And then secondly, my other core value is helping and make a difference. So I've pivoted right now to recognizing I can be in service to others. I'm not driving my business forward, but I do know that I have information, experience, and understanding to be of service to others right now. And so I'm just starting to video. I'm not expecting anything back, but just things that I know that could potentially make someone's day a little bit better. So relying on our core values as an anchor.
Yeah, and that's great. The fact that you're helping and supporting people where you can, which is a wonderful thing to do. So listen, I'm going to have a bit of fun now, because I like to do this with all my speakers. I like to give you a bit of a challenge. I don't know if you know, but I have a time machine, and I like to say to a speaker, so you knowing what you know now, the great experience that you have now, if I took you back to when you first started speaking professionally, what advice would you give yourself?
Well, I am still relatively new to be focusing completely on speaking. So the last 2 to 3 years has been my focus. I think what I'm learning from this is I wish I have focused on resilience earlier. So that would have been one thing I wish I'd have got, because resilience gives me the opportunity to talk about the physical and the psychological. And one of the things I haven't mentioned is I believe that we need to talk about bottom down solutions in organizations, not just top up solutions to the body. So I wish I'd have focused on that earlier. And also something that I'm recognizing is that retrospectively, I wish I would have kept more of my coaching arm of my business going. So not just having just the sole focus on speaking, which had been a year and a half. So I would think keep a bit more of a portfolio going of what you offer.
That is such good advice. Such good advice. Thank you so much for your time, Charlie. That just went so fast. Thank you.
Thank you, Maria. Cheers.